Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
My mother-in-law dropped off 5 of my sister-in-law's kids at our ranch gate. Darling, they're yours until September. What I did next made her cry. Julia wiped the sweat from her forehead. The July sun had been blazing since early morning, but among the lush bougainvillea and delicate petunias, time passed unnoticed. The small sprayer in her hand hissed softly, misting fine droplets over the colorful flower beds. These flowers were her personal achievement, a small miracle she had created with her own hands on land she considered her greatest possession. The ranch, a modest one-story house with a terrace and 2 hectares of land, was bought 3 years ago, before Miguel was even born. At the time, Julia worked as a manager at a pharmaceutical company and saved every peso. Her husband Alejandro had been skeptical of the idea. "Why do we need a ranch?" he shrugged. "We have an apartment in the center of Mexico City. We can go to the park. But it's expensive, far, and constant work." Julia didn't argue. One day, she simply took his hand and brought him here, to a quiet suburb of Cuernavaca. The realtor, a plump woman with tired eyes, showed them the shabby house with clear indifference. It looked more like a shed. The roof leaked in places, the porch steps were rotting, and the old wallpaper gave off a scent of abandonment and gloom. "What a wreck," Alejandro said, stepping into the yard. But Julia stood in the middle of the room with the high ceiling, and she didn't see the peeling paint or the cracks in the floor. She saw a bright living room with a large sofa, a kitchen with a wide table where friends would gather, and a nursery, there had to be a nursery, with toys and a little crib. "We'll renovate it," she said softly, but confidently. "Do you see the view from the window? And the air, do you smell the eucalyptus grove?" Alejandro walked to the window. Beyond the property lay a young eucalyptus grove, emerald green and fresh. Through the gaps in the trees, the shimmering surface of a river was visible, no more than 500 meters away. "Just the renovation will cost 500,000 pesos, he sighed, but Julia noticed the change in his eyes. They signed the purchase agreement a week later. Julia contributed 1.5 million pesos from her savings, nearly everything she had set aside over 5 years of work. She had to borrow another 100,000 pesos from her mother-in-law, Dona Rosa. The older woman didn't ask questions, but pursed her lips when handing over the money. "Make sure it's not for nothing, Julia. Money doesn't come easy these days. Pay me back when you can. I'm not charging interest. After all, we're family." Julia knew that for her mother-in-law, 100,000 pesos wasn't a critical amount. Dona Rosa, a former chief accountant at a major company and now a well-connected retiree with a consulting practice, lived quite comfortably. Still, she began reminding Julia about the loan just a month later. "Julia, any news on my money? I mean, I get that you put it into the renovations, but my grandkids haven't had a vacation, and Luz wants to take them to Playa del Carmen." Luz, Alejandro's older sister, was a constant headache for Julia. Divorced 3 times, with 5 kids from 3 different men, she somehow managed to live extravagantly despite having no formal education or stable job. She did, however, have sponsors, as she called the various men willing to bankroll her whims. Her children, 12-year-old Katerina, 10-year-old twins Diego and Damian, 8-year-old Elena, and 6-year-old Carlos, were regularly dumped either on her mother or on her brother and sister-in-law, whenever Luz went off on yet another romantic getaway. The renovations at the ranch stretched out over a year and a half. Alejandro, to Julia's surprise, proved to be quite handy. He learned how to lay tile, plaster walls, and even rewired the house himself after watching a dozen tutorial videos. Julia picked out materials, painted, and sewed curtains. On weekends, friends would come over to help, offering both advice and manual labor. In return, Julia hosted barbecues with carne asada and homemade empanadas. By the time the main renovation work was done, Julia found out she was pregnant. The decision to move from the city apartment to the ranch came naturally. She wanted to give birth and raise the baby in the fresh air, far from the noise and rush of the city. Alejandro wasn't immediately on board. He worried about being far from hospitals and his office. But after a few trial commutes, which took just over an hour each way, he agreed that living out of town was doable. Miguel was born in May, and his first months were spent in a cozy home surrounded by flowers and trees. Julia set up a nursery with a big window facing east so the morning sun could gently wake him. By the end of summer, a new routine had formed. After feeding Miguel in the morning, Julia would leave him sleeping with his father. Alejandro worked remotely 3 days a week and head out into the garden. Those 1.5 to 2 hours alone with her plants became her personal paradise, a time of peace and creation. "How do you do it?" Alejandro would sometimes ask, admiring the lush flower beds. "My mom's been growing flowers for 20 years and never had anything like this." Julia would just smile. There was no secret, only love, patience, and constant care. That morning, she had just finished watering the eastern flower bed when she heard the distinct sound of a car approaching. Visitors were rare. Friends usually warned them in advance and came in the evenings, after work. So Julia looked toward the gate with some confusion, expecting maybe a neighbor. The gate creaked open, and in marched Dona Rosa, a large woman in her 60s, impeccably coiffed and dressed in an ivory summer suit. Behind her, like ducklings trailing a mother duck, came 5 children, Luz's kids, all scruffy and noisy as usual. "Julia, come greet your guests." The children scattered across the yard like peas from a torn sack. Carlos ran straight to the flower bed and reached for the bright orange lilies. The twins made a beeline for the swing set, shoving and arguing mid-run about who would go first. Elena climbed into the avocado tree, and Katerina, the oldest, buried her face in her phone, broadcasting her complete indifference to the situation. "Hello, Dona Rosa," Julia said calmly, setting the watering can down and gently intercepting Carlos's hand, which was already about to pluck a flower. "Careful, sweetheart, there are thorns. You'll hurt yourself." "And where's Alejandro?" Her mother-in-law glanced around as if expecting to find her son hiding behind the bushes. "I called him, but he's not answering." "He's with Miguel," Julia nodded toward the house. "The baby fell asleep after feeding, and Alejandro's working. He has an important video conference today." Yes, he's always so busy," Dona Rosa nodded meaningfully. "Well, let's not disturb him. Julia, I've come on a little matter. Luz flew off to Ibiza for 2 weeks with that guy of hers. What's his name?" "Rodrigo. The one who sells cars. I would have taken the kids myself, but you know, there's construction at my place, workers, dust, all that noise. And I thought, why should they suffocate in the city? You have fresh air here, space, a river nearby." Julia felt a tight knot forming in her chest. She already knew where this was going but still clung to a faint hope that she was wrong. "So I brought the grandchildren to you," Dona Rosa finished, leaving no room for discussion. "They'll stay until the end of summer. You've got nothing else to do, staying home, growing flowers." She gave the flower beds a cursory glance. "And at least the kids will get some fresh air, splash in the river. Miguel will have more fun too, won't be growing up all alone." "Dona Rosa," Julia said, keeping her tone steady, "Miguel is 3 months old. How is he supposed to have fun with 5 older kids? He needs quiet and a stable routine." "Oh, don't start with that modern nonsense," her mother-in-law waved her off. "We all grew up surrounded by noise and chaos, and we turned out just fine. Besides, what's there to discuss? I've already decided. The kids' things are in the car. Juan will bring them in." Juan, Dona Rosa's new boyfriend, a driver and jack of all trades, was already opening the trunk of the aging Sentra. Julia counted at least 10 bags and parcels. It looked like the children were planning a long stay. She exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Years of dealing with her mother-in-law had taught her to control her emotions, never letting irritation or anger show. There was no point arguing now. Dona Rosa was in her element, using her usual tactics, forcefulness and finality, trying to leave no room for choice. But there's always a choice. Sometimes, you just need time to find the right one. All right, Julia nodded, watching as the twins began roughhousing under the avocado tree, nearly knocking over Elena, who was just climbing down. Let them settle in. Will you be staying for lunch? Oh no, Juan and I have to stop by the hardware store and then visit the designer. So much to do, Dona Rosa visibly relaxed, realizing her daughter-in-law wasn't going to make a scene. And what could you possibly cook right now for this whole crowd? I'll send groceries by delivery tomorrow, enough for everyone. Juan was already groaning as he hauled the bags toward the house. Julia went to open the terrace door so he could bring the luggage inside. Where would she even put 5 kids in their modest house? They'd have to squeeze in, maybe set up sleeping bags in the living room. Alejandro appeared in the doorway, bleary-eyed, his hair tousled, a pillow crease still visible on his cheek. He must have dozed off beside their son. Mama, he said, surprised to see his mother, then scanned the yard full of children and frowned. What's going on? Alejandro. Dona Rosa rushed over to hug him. You're still asleep while we're here sorting out family matters. Luz flew off to Ibiza, so the kids will stay with you till the end of summer. What? Alejandro was now fully awake. Mom, we can't. Yes, you can, Dona Rosa cut him off, patting his shoulder. Julia and I already talked, she's fine with it. Right, Julia? Julia said nothing, her eyes fixed on her husband. Let him decide, it was his mother and his nieces and nephews, after all. Alejandro looked at her, clearly seeking support, but she only gave a slight shrug. Arguing now was pointless. His mother would do what she wanted anyway. What Julia needed was time to think. Well, okay, Alejandro said uncertainly. If Julia doesn't mind. Wonderful, Dona Rosa beamed. Carlos, Elena. Come give Uncle Alejandro a kiss. The children ran over, and Alejandro awkwardly hugged them, still glancing at his wife with confusion. Julia turned away and began gathering the garden tools. Inside, a plan had already begun to take shape, clear, firm, and deliberate. She knew exactly what she needed to do. But first, she had to wait until her mother-in-law left. The sun was now at its peak, promising a scorching day. Birds chirped from the eucalyptus grove, but their song was drowned out by the shrieks and chatter of children. Julia's quiet haven had suddenly turned into a noisy harbor, and now it was time to bring order to it. On her own terms. When the white Sentra disappeared around the bend, Julia stood still for a few seconds, watching the dust clouds it left behind on the road. As if in slow motion, she watched the twins breaking branches off the young avocado tree she and Alejandro had planted that spring. Carlos was enthusiastically digging a hole in the middle of the lawn with the garden trowel Julia had left by the flower bed. Elena was swinging on the makeshift swing, soaring so high the ropes creaked ominously. Only Katerina, the eldest, sat in the shade of the terrace, eyes glued to her smartphone. Alejandro, Julia turned to her husband, trying to keep her voice calm. You do realize this is impossible, right? We have a 3-month-old baby. We can't take on 5 more kids for the whole summer. Alejandro sighed, rubbing the back of his head in confusion. There was something boyish and helpless in the gesture, and Julia felt a familiar pang of irritation. In situations like this, her husband always reverted into a hesitant little boy, unable to stand up to his domineering mother. I'll talk to her tonight on the phone, he said uncertainly. I'll explain that we really can't handle it. No, Julia shook her head. Talking won't help. Your mother only hears what she wants to hear. This calls for action. A piercing cry rang out from inside the house. Miguel had woken up, disturbed by the noise. Julia rushed inside, leaving Alejandro to deal with his nephews and nieces. On the terrace, she was nearly knocked over by Carlos, who was being chased and screamed at by Diego. Hey! Quiet, she raised her voice for the first time. There's a baby in the house. If you want to run and yell, go outside. The boys froze, stunned by the rare sternness in their usually gentle Aunt Julia. Then they silently slipped out into the yard. Julia hurried to the bedroom, where Miguel was wailing, flailing his tiny fists in distress. There, sweetheart, she said, scooping him into her arms and holding him close. It's okay. Mama will figure something out. Mama's got this. By evening, the house had descended into complete chaos. Despite Julia's best efforts, the children seemed to be competing over who could make the biggest mess. In the kitchen, the twins had knocked over a jar of flour while trying to make a volcano from a YouTube tutorial. Carlos had crawled into the linen closet and made a cave, thoroughly crumpling the clean sheets. Elena had found Julia's makeup bag and turned her face into a creepy clown mask with lipstick and eyeshadow experiments. Only Katerina still remained uninvolved in the madness, but her constant sulking and discontented scowl were just as exhausting as the younger kids' hyperactivity. As she drifted off to sleep, Julia felt tension gripping her body like a vice. Miguel, unaccustomed to noise, had been fussy all evening and took forever to fall asleep. Alejandro, after an unsuccessful phone call with his mother, who said she didn't see any problem and insisted the children weren't bothering anyone, shut down and barely spoke. The morning began with a piercing scream. Julia, who had just finished feeding Miguel and putting him back in his crib, ran out onto the terrace. Elena, tear-streaked and sobbing, was smearing snot across her cheeks. What happened? Julia knelt in front of the girl. They threw my unicorn in the toilet, Elena sobbed, pointing at the twins, who were pretending the whole thing had nothing to do with them. Julia spent the next hour sorting out the situation, comforting Elena and scolding the boys. Then came the effort to retrieve the pink plastic unicorn, which had gotten thoroughly lodged in the toilet, completely blocking the drain. She had to call a plumber from the nearby village, who charged 500 pesos for his services. Once the unicorn was rescued and the plumbing restored, Julia locked herself in the bedroom where Miguel was napping and opened her laptop. She could no longer afford to wait and hope for her mother-in-law's reasonableness. It was time to act. She spent the next 2 hours researching summer camps in their state. Luck was on her side. Just 15 kilometers from their ranch was a camp called Sol y Luna, which accepted kids for 2 to 3 week sessions. The third session had just started the day before, and as Julia learned during a phone call with the camp office, there were still spots available. Several children hadn't arrived due to a chickenpox outbreak in their family. 5 spots, the camp director, an older, energetic woman, said with some surprise when Julia arrived for a meeting, having left the children with Alejandro. Well, that's doable. We have good conditions, 4 bedrooms, 5 meals a day, a swimming pool, sports fields, and creative workshops. The price for one session was substantial, 20,000 pesos per child for 3 weeks. Julia did the math in her head and whistled silently, 100,000 pesos. Almost the exact amount she and Alejandro had been saving to repay the loan to her mother-in-law. I can pay right now, she said firmly, pulling out her bank card. And I'd like the children to check in as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning, the director asked briskly. We'll need parental ID, birth certificates, and medical records. There might be some issues with the documents, Julia bit her lip. The parents are away. I'm their aunt, temporarily looking after them. The director frowned, but Julia was already reaching into her bag. I have a power of attorney from their mother, she said, handing over a document bearing Luz's sweeping signature. It authorizes me to make all decisions concerning the children, including vacation and health arrangements. The power of attorney had been drafted 6 months ago when Luz went to Cancun, leaving the kids with Julia for the Christmas holidays. Luckily, the document was still valid. Well, if that's the case, the director said, carefully studying the document. Get the rest of the paperwork ready. We'll expect them tomorrow. When Julia returned home, she walked into a full-blown apocalypse. Alejandro was sitting on the terrace with a pale, exhausted face. Miguel was crying in his carrier. The twins were tearing around the yard, shouting something unintelligible. The other kids had apparently scattered in all directions. I can't do this, Alejandro said quietly as Julia scooped up their crying son. They're like a natural disaster. I looked away for just a minute, and they'd already broken the shed window, dug up the chilly bed, and thrown Miguel's stuffed bunny into the pond. The bunny? Julia gasped, glancing around in horror. The bunny? The vintage one? From your grandmother, the one that's 60 years old? Alejandro nodded guiltily. Julia closed her eyes and silently counted to 10 to calm herself. That heirloom toy was a true family treasure, one she especially cherished. Okay, she said calmly once she could speak again. I've got a solution. Everything changes tomorrow. What are you planning? Alejandro looked at her with concern. You'll see, Julia smiled with such quiet certainty that Alejandro tensed instinctively. He recognized that look, firm, unshakable. It was the look his wife had whenever she'd made up her mind and nothing in the world could stop her. That evening, Julia gathered the kids in the living room. Even Katerina set down her phone, intrigued by her aunt's serious tone. Tomorrow, you're in for a surprise, Julia announced. We're going to a real summer camp. A camp? The twins exchanged matching skeptical looks. Sol y Luna, Julia nodded. There's a pool, sports fields, creative workshops, and even discos. Discos? Katerina perked up for the first time. Are phones allowed? At designated times, yes, Julia smiled. And they have great food, tons of activities, and you'll make new friends. Does Mom know? Alina suddenly asked, clutching her rescued unicorn tightly to her chest. Julia hesitated for a split second, but quickly recovered. Of course. It's a surprise, for both you and Grandma. Your mom's been wanting to send you to a good camp for a while. Awesome! Diego shouted, and his brother Damian nodded enthusiastically. Only Carlos, the youngest, looked worried. Are you coming with us? He asked, grabbing Julia's hand with his sticky fingers. No, sweetheart, she replied gently. I'll stay here with Miguel. He's still too little for camp. But there will be wonderful counselors there who'll take great care of you. Later, once the kids had scattered to their rooms, Alejandro pulled Julia aside. Are you sure about this? He whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Mom's going to be furious. Do we need her permission? Julia raised an eyebrow. She didn't ask us before dropping the kids off. And if you think about it, I'm not even sure Luz knows where her kids are right now. Your sister handed them off to your mother and flew off to a resort, didn't she? Alejandro sighed, conceding the point. But the camp? It's a lot of money. I'm using the money we were saving to repay your mother, Julia said calmly. Consider it a kind of repayment. We were planning to return 100,000 pesos to her. That's almost exactly what the camp costs for all 5 kids. Alejandro let out a low whistle. But, you know she'll demand the money anyway. You know my mom. Let her, Julia shrugged. We did what she asked. We took care of the kids. We just did it our way. I'm not turning our home into a 24/7 daycare center, unpaid and with no breaks. Alejandro shook his head, but Julia could see he was almost convinced. Deep down, he knew this was the best way out. Just imagine, she said, taking his hand, 3 weeks of peace and quiet. Just the 3 of us, you, me, and Miguel. Evenings on the terrace, listening to the crickets, drinking coffee with cinnamon. No screaming, no running, no broken windows, no flooded bathrooms. Alejandro smiled despite himself, picturing the idyllic scene. All right, he said with resolve. I'm with you. Let's just wait until the kids are at camp before telling my mom. Otherwise, she'll ruin everything. Julia hugged him, relieved. For the first time in 2 days, she felt like the situation was under control. The next morning, the camp minibus arrived at the ranch gate promptly at 9. The kids, strangely subdued and excited, stood lined up on the porch with their packed backpacks and bags. Julia helped load the luggage, handed the folder with documents and a bag of snacks to the camp counselor, a young man in a t-shirt with the camp logo, and watched as they got ready to leave. Behave yourselves, Julia instructed the children, feeling a vague sense of unease. Listen to the counselors. Katerina, you're the oldest, keep an eye on the younger ones. Carlos, don't forget to brush your teeth at night. Alina. Everything will be fine, the counselor said confidently. We've been welcoming kids for 15 years, great program, wonderful staff. Julia nodded, forcing a smile. Strangely, now that her plan was about to come to life, a twinge of guilt crept in. These kids weren't to blame, it was Luz and Dona Rosa who had failed to teach them manners, who had deprived them of proper care and attention. I'll call you, she promised Carlos, who was clutching her hand tightly. And you call too, okay? The children nodded, gradually catching the counselor's enthusiasm as he talked about upcoming competitions and bonfires. Even Katerina was listening with interest. When the minibus disappeared around the bend, Juliet and Alejandro exchanged glances. A strange silence settled over the ranch, unfamiliar after 2 days of constant noise. So what now? Alejandro asked, wrapping his arm around Julia's shoulders. Now, she said, taking a deep breath, the storm begins. But I'm ready. As if on cue, the phone rang. Dona Rosa's name lit up on the screen. It's starting, Alejandro said quietly, looking at his wife with a mix of worry and admiration. Juliet answered calmly. Her face turned serious and focused, like a general before a decisive battle. She was ready to defend her space, her family, her boundaries, at any cost. Julia. Darling, her mother-in-law's voice cooed suspiciously sweet through the receiver. How's everything going? The kids behaving? I was thinking of stopping by, bringing them some sweets. Julia glanced at Alejandro and turned on speakerphone so he could hear too. Dona Rosa, she began evenly, the children aren't here. A pause. So long and deep they could hear the television murmuring in the background on her end. What do you mean, not here? Dona Rosa's voice turned silky, the way a predator sounds just before it pounces. Where did they go? What did you do with them? I sent them to the Soul Y Luna Children's Camp. It's 15 kilometers from here, a very good place. What? The outburst was so loud Alejandro instinctively recoiled from the phone. You did what? Julia, are you out of your mind? How dare you make decisions about my grandchildren? I dared the same way you dared to make decisions about my home, Julia replied calmly, though she was shaking inside. You brought the children here without warning, gave us no choice, and didn't ask for our consent. How dare you? Dona Rosa was gasping with outrage. Put Alejandro on the phone. I demand to speak to my son, right now. Julia handed the phone to her husband. He hesitated, cleared his throat, and answered. Hi, Mom. Alejandro, his mother's tone instantly shifted from furious to tearful. Son, what has that woman done to your nieces and nephews? How could you let her do this? They're just little children. Carlos is probably crying right now. Mama, Alejandro looked at Julia, who gave him an encouraging nod. This was our decision, together. The kids were happy to go. The camp has great facilities, 5 meals a day, a swimming pool. I don't care about the facilities. Dona Rosa exploded again. You can't just send someone else's children off to God knows where. I'm coming over right now. You have 1 hour to bring them back, or I'm going to the police. The police? Julia couldn't help herself, she jumped back into the conversation. On what grounds, exactly? First, we have a notarized power of attorney from Luz authorizing us to act on her behalf regarding the children. Second, we paid for their stay at a certified camp with excellent care. And third, we didn't kidnap them, abandon them, or leave them unsupervised, unlike their mother, I might add. Don't you dare bring Luz into this. Dona Rosa's voice hit a near ultrasonic pitch. She's a young woman, she has a right to her personal life. For 3 weeks, Julia interrupted. Without notice. Without preparation. Without asking. We have a 3-month-old baby, Dona Rosa. Do you even realize what it's like to have 5 kids of different ages in a house with an infant? Oh please, they're just kids, she scoffed. In our day, we raised 10 at a time, no big deal. You're just a spoiled city girl, that's your problem. Alejandro took the phone again. Mom, enough. Stop attacking Julia. She did the right thing. We can't keep the kids here, we simply don't have the means. But you did have money for the camp, Dona Rosa launched her counterattack. Those are the same 100,000 pesos you owe me, aren't they? You spent my money? Yes, Julia saw no point in denying the obvious. That's right. Consider it repayment, we used it to pay for your grandchildren's stay at the camp. What? Dona Rosa sounded like she might explode from indignation. That's daylight robbery. You were supposed to return that money in cash, not waste it on some. Mama, Alejandro's voice suddenly turned firm. You created this situation yourself. We didn't ask you to bring the kids. We never agreed to babysit them all summer. We did the best we could under the circumstances, gave them a quality vacation in a good place. Julia looked at her husband in surprise. She had never heard him speak to his mother so assertively. And another thing, Alejandro continued, I support Julia's decision. 5 kids in a house with an infant is too much. We physically can't handle it. And if you thought we were going to look after losers' children for free all summer, you were mistaken. There was a strange sound on the other end of the line, somewhere between a gasp and a growl. It's her, isn't it? Dona Rosa finally hissed. She's turning you against your own mother. My son would never talk to me like this. Mama, Alejandro now sounded tired. I'm an adult. This was my decision. And I'm asking you, please, let's stop this. The children are safe. They're doing well. If you want to take them back, go ahead. Drive to the camp and get them. Just know, they'll be staying with you, not with us. I'm coming over right now, she snapped, and hung up. Alejandro slowly lowered the phone and looked at Julia. A wave of emotions passed over his face, worry, frustration, and a strange kind of relief. She's coming here, he said, running a hand through his hair. It's going to be a scene. I know, Julia said, stepping toward him and wrapping her arms around him. Thank you for backing me up. I should have done it a long time ago, he sighed. Mom's always been like this, forcing things on everyone, ignoring other people's plans and boundaries. And I always gave in. Julia rubbed his back gently. In the 5 years they'd been together, she had learned not to pressure him when it came to his family. Everyone had to set boundaries with their own relatives, that was her rule. I think we've got about 40 minutes, she said finally. Let's make some coffee. And maybe get out the calming tea, for everyone involved. Dona Rosa stormed into the yard like a tornado. The door of her old Sentra slammed shut so hard the window panes rattled. Even Juan, usually unflappable, looked uneasy as he scurried behind her toward the house. Where are they, those, she began as she charged onto the terrace, but stopped short when she saw Julia calmly sitting at the table, rocking Miguel in her arms. Good morning, Dona Rosa, Julia stood to greet her. Come in, the coffee's just ready. Alejandro, pour your mother a cup, please. Dona Rosa hesitated for a second, caught off guard by the hospitality, but quickly recovered. What the hell kind of coffee, she exploded. Where are the children? At the Sol Luna camp, Julia repeated patiently. It's 15 kilometers from here, by the lake. A wonderful place, secure grounds, qualified staff. Don't you try to distract me with your fancy descriptions. Dona Rosa dropped heavily onto a chair Juan had helpfully pulled out for her. What right did you have to make decisions about the children? And what right did you have to drop them here without asking? Julia countered, gently bouncing Miguel, who had started fussing from all the shouting. At least I have a legal power of attorney from Luz. Luz is their mother. I am their grandmother. We have every right to make decisions. To make decisions, yes. But not to dump responsibility on others, Julia kept her tone even, though she was seething inside. You didn't ask us whether we could take care of 5 children. You simply showed up and left them. That's not respect, Dona Rosa. What do you know about respect? Her mother-in-law threw up her hands. You live in this, she gestured with contempt at the cozy living room, ranch that you bought with my money. Mine and yours, Alejandro interjected, placing a cup of coffee in front of her. And Julia invested far more in the purchase and renovation. Oh sure, go ahead and remind me of everything I supposedly owe you, Dona Rosa sneered. The 100,000 pesos, which you've now wasted on God knows what. On your grandchildren, Julia said, still rocking Miguel, who was now whimpering softly. If you calculate what a nanny would charge for 3 weeks of care for 5 children, the amount is about the same. But we're family, right? Yes, Dona Rosa's voice suddenly shifted to a more sentimental tone. And in a family, we don't count money. We help each other selflessly. That's exactly why you lent us the 100,000 with a signed IOU and reminded us of the debt every month? Julia's question hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Dona Rosa opened her mouth, then shut it again. Red blotches appeared on her cheeks. That's different, she finally blurted out. I have my own obligations. Luz and the kids, the apartment needed repairs. We have our obligations too, Julia said gently. And our own life. With a newborn. That doesn't mean we don't love our nieces and nephews or don't want to help. But there's a limit to everything. Dona Rosa suddenly seemed to deflate, like the air had gone out of her. She took a sip of her coffee, grimacing as if it were poison. Fine, she muttered at last. Let it be that way. But the money, my money, you still spend it without asking. That's overstepping. Dona Rosa, Julia turned her gaze to Juan, who was shifting awkwardly near the door. You understand that everyone shares some blame here. Luz, for leaving the kids with you. You, for bringing them to us without asking. And us, for not being able to care for them all summer. Let's not make it worse. The kids are in a good place, and they're happy there. How do you know that? Dona Rosa asked suspiciously. Katerina already called me, Julia lied, silently promising herself to call the camp right after this conversation. They got settled in, met the counselors, they're just about to have lunch now. Dona Rosa was silent, clearly thinking. Fine, she said at last. But I want to see them. I'm going to that camp right now. Of course, Julia nodded. Here are the directions and the camp's phone number. She handed her mother-in-law a slip of paper where she had neatly written down all the details in advance. Dona Rosa snatched it like a piece of incriminating evidence. Let's go, Juan, she said firmly, rising to her feet. We'll see what kind of camp this really is. At the door, she turned back and gave Julia a withering glare. And don't think you'll get away with this. You'll pay me back, all 100,000 pesos. I won't accept a cent less. As you wish, Julia replied calmly, though her stomach clenched with anxiety. They didn't have that kind of money right now. When the car door slammed and the engine noise faded into silence, Alejandro collapsed onto the couch, completely drained. They've gone to camp, Alejandro said, rubbing his temples. What do you think she's going to do there? Nothing dramatic, Julia shrugged, though she wasn't entirely sure. She'll check out the conditions, maybe talk to the kids. Worst case scenario, she takes them back. Which, frankly, would be better for us. At least they'd go to her place, not back here. What if Alejandro hesitated. What if she says we kidnapped Luz's kids? Or claims we stole them or something? With a notarized power of attorney from their mother? Julia gave a strained smile. Highly unlikely. And Katerina's old enough to explain there was no kidnapping. They were happy to go to camp. Alejandro nodded, but worry still clouded his face. I need to call them, Julia said firmly. Check how they're doing, make sure everything's fine. The conversation with the camp director was brief and informative. The children had settled in well, met their cabin mates and counselors, had lunch, and were currently resting before the afternoon activities. "Wonderful," said Julia. "And one more thing, the children's grandmother is on her way. Please allow her to visit, it's important." "Of course," the director replied professionally. "It's rest time now, so relatives are welcome. Don't worry, everything will be fine." After thanking her, Julia hung up and turned to her husband. "They're fine. All settled, and they like it there. I think your mom will calm down once she sees the setup." "I hope so," Alejandro gave a weak smile. "You know, I'm proud of you. You handled all of this and didn't lose it once." "I just know what I want," Julia said, sitting down beside him on the couch. "And I know that sometimes you have to fight for your space. For the three of us." Alejandro put his arm around her, and they sat in silence for a while, enjoying the sudden and unfamiliar quiet in the house. Around 6 in the evening, the phone rang again. Julia flinched slightly when she saw Dona Rosa's name on the screen. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "So, here's the deal," Dona Rosa's voice was dry and formal. "I checked out that camp of yours. The conditions are acceptable. The kids say they like it. But that doesn't change how outraged I am by your actions. I'm glad you've seen for yourself that the children are safe and comfortable," Julia said gently. "That's what matters most." Yes, Dona Rosa interrupted irritably. "Now listen carefully. I'm willing," she paused, as if the words were physically difficult to say, "I'm willing to agree that the children can stay at the camp until the end of the session. But, after that, they're coming to live with me. I've already spoken with Luz, she's flying back in a week." "Of course," Julia exhaled in relief. "We weren't expecting the kids to come back here after camp anyway. And another thing," Dona Rosa added after a pause. "You still owe me that money. And interest. I'm not letting this go." "We'll discuss that later," Julia replied diplomatically. "Right now, the most important thing is that the children are safe and doing well." Dona Rosa muttered something unintelligible and hung up. Julia laughed, nervously, but with genuine relief. "She's letting the kids stay in camp," she told Alejandro. "After that, they'll go to her place." "Thank God," Alejandro leaned back on the couch. "So, we won?" "More like reached a truce," Julia smiled. "Your mother still insists we owe her the money, but I think she'll let it go over time." Alejandro suddenly froze, as if something had just occurred to him. "What if she sues us?" "For the money?" "She might," Julia admitted, thinking it over. "But then we'll explain to the judge that we used the money to care for her grandchildren, who she dropped on us without warning. And that we have a notarized power of attorney from their mother. And that the kids are happy at camp, not suffering in a cramped house without proper supervision," Alejandro added, starting to grin. "And that grandma refused to take them back when you offered." "Exactly," Julia nodded. "I don't think it'll come to that. But if it does, we're ready." That evening, after Miguel had fallen asleep in his crib, Julia and Alejandro sat on the terrace, enjoying the silence and the scent of blooming bougainvillea. Then the phone rang again, this time from an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" Julia answered cautiously. "You miserable witch," came a breathless, furious female voice. "What did you do to my children?" "Luz." The sister-in-law had finally found out what happened, and judging by her tone, she was absolutely livid. "Hello, Luz," Julia replied calmly. "I sent your children to the Sol Luna camp. It's a wonderful place, by the way. I don't give a damn what kind of place it is." Luz shrieked. "You had no right. I didn't give you permission." "No?" Julia walked over to the table where a folder of documents lay. "Then what about the power of attorney you signed back in December? It's still valid, by the way." That was different," Luz stammered. "Back then, I knew where I was going and for how long. And now?" Julia tried hard to keep her voice steady. Now you left your kids with your mother and flew off to Ibiza with your latest sponsor, she said coldly. And your mother dropped them off here, without asking us. She didn't tell me that, Luz said, surprised. She just said the kids were being looked after. They are being looked after, Julia confirmed. By trained educators in a reputable camp. They're well fed, engaged in fun activities, and safe. What's the problem? Luz was clearly thrown off. I should have been told. They're my kids. Next time, Julia said, still striving for calm, don't leave them without warning. Alejandro and I didn't sign up to be free nannies for the whole summer. Luz was silent for a moment, then spoke in a softer tone. Mama says you spent her money. The money she lent you. Yes, Julia didn't deny it. The camp cost almost 100,000 pesos. Madre mia. Luz whistled under her breath. So what now? I don't know, Julia admitted honestly. Maybe your mother will sue us. Maybe she'll just accept the situation. Aren't you scared? Luz's voice carried something unexpected, a hint of respect. Of what? Julia shrugged, though Luz couldn't see it. I did what I thought was right under the circumstances. The kids are safe and happy. What's there to be afraid of? You're weird, Luz said after a pause. You've always been so quiet, never said a word out of line. And now, this whole thing. I didn't make a scene, Julia corrected gently. I solved a problem that wasn't ours to begin with. Luz gave a small chuckle, and for the first time, there was no anger in it. All right, fine, whatever, Luz said. Camp it is. But I'm coming back in a week and taking the kids. And I won't make any claims against you, got it? If Mom starts giving you trouble, I'll confirm I gave you the right to make decisions. Thank you, Julia said sincerely. That means a lot to me. It should for all of us, Luz laughed unexpectedly. Mom's completely off the rails. She doesn't recognize boundaries at all. After saying goodbye to her sister-in-law, Julia returned to the terrace where Alejandro was waiting. Luz, he asked, and Julia nodded. And how did it go? She screamed at first, then calmed down, Julia said, sitting beside him. She promised to take the kids when she gets back and said she has no complaints against us. Amazing, Alejandro shook his head. I never thought Luz would be the more reasonable one compared to Mom. She just has different priorities, Julia smiled. Romantic getaways matter more to her than fighting with us. They sat together on the terrace, watching the first stars appear above the eucalyptus grove. For the first time in many days, the air rang with silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves. What do you think will happen next? Alejandro asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. I don't know, Julia answered honestly. But I'm ready for whatever comes. And it was true. Now that she had defended the boundaries of her family, her home, and her life, Julia felt strong enough to handle anything, even if that anything was named Dona Rosa and came with the full force of a looming storm. The following week passed in an odd, tense calm. Dona Rosa seemed to have gone silent, not even calling her son. This silence unsettled Julia more than open confrontation. Her mother-in-law was not the type to simply surrender or admit defeat. I don't like this quiet, Julia said as she set the breakfast table. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and sunlight streamed across the terrace. Miguel slept peacefully in his bassinet beside the dining table. You're too suspicious, Alejandro reached for the agave honey. Maybe Mom finally accepted that you were right? Julia raised a skeptical eyebrow, and Alejandro laughed. Okay, too good to be true. But maybe she did realize she went too far. Or she's preparing a counterattack, Julia muttered, sipping her coffee. You know your mother, she's not one to let go of a grudge. Alejandro sighed, acknowledging the truth in her words. Dona Rosa was infamous for her vindictiveness. Once, she hadn't spoken to a neighbor for nearly a year over a supposed insult about her new haircut. In any case, we have a bit of a breather now, Alejandro said. Let's just enjoy the peace and quiet. Luz will be back in a week. She'll take the kids from camp, and everything will settle down. Julia nodded, though her inner voice told her things wouldn't be that simple. Her instincts proved right the very next day. Alejandro, checking the mail, found an official letter from a law firm. After scanning it quickly, he went pale. "What is it?" Julia asked, alarmed. "Mom filed an official claim demanding the money back," he said, handing her the document. "With interest and damages for emotional distress. Total, 130,000 pesos. Julia read the letter slowly. Written in cold legal language, it left no doubt Dona Rosa was seriously pursuing legal action. "We don't have that kind of money," she said quietly. "And even if we did, it's not fair." Alejandro sat beside her, his hands cradling his head. "She always does this," he murmured. "Pushes and pushes until she gets what she wants. It was the same with my dad. No compromise, no forgiveness. What are we going to do?" Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know," he looked at her, exhausted. "First, I'll try to talk to her. Maybe I can reason with her. And if that doesn't work, we'll need legal advice," he sighed. "I'm still not sure she'll actually take this to court. Most likely, she's just trying to scare us." "Let's hope so," Julia said, trying to stay calm, though anxiety was tightening inside her like a knot. On Monday morning, Julia was getting ready to take Miguel for a routine pediatric checkup. As she stepped outside with the baby in her arms, she noticed a black car parked by the gate. Standing beside it were two men in dark suits. "Julia Garcia," one of them asked, showing her some kind of ID. "I'm with the Court Enforcement Service. We're here to deliver a notice." He handed her the envelope, which Julia took with her free hand, struggling to hold the now awake and whimpering Miguel. "What is this?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling. "A notice of property seizure," the officer replied flatly. "Filed by citizen Rosa Mendoza for debt collection. Your land and house are temporarily frozen pending a court decision." Julia felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Her mother-in-law had gone on the offensive faster than they'd expected. "But how is that even possible?" She tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "There hasn't even been a court hearing yet." "It's a provisional measure," the second officer explained. "Ms. Mendoza submitted a signed promissory note and evidence suggesting you might attempt to sell the property before the case is heard." "That's absurd," Julia raised her voice, which only made Miguel cry louder. "We're not selling anything. This is our home." The officers looked at her with the expressionless calm of people who had seen this scene play out dozens of times before. "We're just carrying out the court order," said the first. "You can appeal through the proper legal channels. In the meantime, you are allowed to live here, but you can't conduct any transactions involving the property." They asked her to sign the receipt for the notification, which Julia did with a trembling hand. Then they got back into their car and drove away, leaving her standing there with the envelope in one hand and a crying baby in the other. When Alejandro returned, she told him what had happened. His reaction was predictable, first shock, then helpless fury. "I'm going over there right now," he snapped, grabbing his car keys. "This is too much." "Wait," Julia grabbed his arm. "Let's not act out of anger. We need a plan." "What plan?" Alejandro was on the verge of losing it. "My mother is trying to take our house just to get revenge." "What is there to plan?" "That's exactly what she wants," Julia said calmly. "For us to panic and make reckless decisions. There has to be another way." Alejandro took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "You're right," he finally said. "First, we talk to a lawyer." Julia nodded, already turning over possible strategies in her mind. By midweek, the situation had become even more tense. The lawyer they consulted offered little reason for optimism. "The promissory note is properly written," he said after reviewing the documents. "You do have a legal debt, and the repayment deadline has long passed. In theory, the court could side with the plaintiff. But we spent that money on her grandchildren. Alejandro protested. Doesn't that count for anything? Legally speaking, no, the lawyer shrugged. You used the money at your discretion, without the lender's consent. From a legal standpoint, that doesn't release you from the obligation to repay the debt. So what do we do now? Julia asked wearily. The best option is to try to reach a settlement, the lawyer advised. Perhaps your mother-in-law would agree to a payment plan or some other compromise. She won't, Alejandro said grimly. You don't know my mother. That evening, Julia sat on the terrace, staring absently at the sunset. Miguel slept in his stroller beside her, and the silence felt almost tangible. Suddenly, her phone rang, Luz's number. Hello? Julia picked up, bracing herself for another round of drama. Hey, sister-in-law, Luz's voice was surprisingly friendly. I'm back. How are my little rascals? They're still at camp, Julia replied, surprised by the calm tone. They're doing great, I called to check. The session ends the day after tomorrow. Yeah, they called me too, Luz chuckled. They want me to come for the end-of-session ceremony. Can you believe Carlos got some kind of award for a cactus craft? And Katerina, well, she's got a thing going on with some boy there, you know, first love and all that. Julia couldn't help but smile. Luz sounded like a normal, proud mom, not the frantic, irresponsible woman who usually pushed her problems onto others. Listen, Luz said suddenly, her tone turning serious. I know what Mom did. And that's low. Even for her. Yes, Julia agreed quietly. We didn't think she'd go that far. You don't know our mother, Luz said with a bitter laugh. She'll go as far as it takes if she thinks she's been wronged. When I divorced my first husband, a decent guy, honestly, it just didn't work out. She launched such a vendetta that she's still fighting him in court. And that was almost 13 years ago. So what do we do? Julia asked, feeling a strange sense of relief at finally being able to speak openly with someone who truly understood the situation. I have an idea, Luz lowered her voice, though it was unlikely anyone could overhear. Mom doesn't know this, but I've got something on her. Documents. Let's just say, compromising ones. What kind of documents? Julia asked cautiously. Doesn't matter, Luz cut her off. Let's just say that if they end up in the right hands, Mom will have serious trouble with the tax authorities, and not only them. In short, it's our insurance policy. Julia was silent, thinking. The idea of blackmail made her uncomfortable, but on the other hand, Dona Rosa had left them no real alternative. Are you sure? She asked at last. Maybe we should still try to negotiate. With her? Luz laughed bitterly. No, honey. She's too far gone. Now it's about proving who's boss. She'd rather drag you through court and take your house than admit she was wrong. But what about your relationship with her? Julia thought of Alejandro, who, despite his frustration, still loved his mother and was deeply hurt by the conflict. Relationship? Luz's voice turned sharp with bitterness. There's no such thing with her, only submission. I put up with it my whole life, and look at how I turned out, a woman who can't build a normal family and runs from every responsibility. And my kids, they suffer too. You should have seen them at camp after just 1 week, happy, calm, confident. Because for once, someone treated them like real children, not a constant nuisance. Julia remained silent, stunned by the unexpected honesty. I'm coming tomorrow, Luz said firmly. We'll sit down and figure this out. And please, don't tell Alejandro yet. He's my brother, and I love him, but he's always been too proper. You and I need to handle this woman to woman. After ending the call, Julia sat motionless for a long time, staring at the fading sunset. Inside her, a storm of emotions churned: fear, resolve, uncertainty. But somewhere deep down, a fragile hope began to form that maybe, just maybe, things could still be made right. Luz arrived the next morning, poised, tanned, dressed in an elegant linen suit. She parked her brand new white Audi by the ranch gate, pulled a folder of documents from the trunk, and strode purposefully toward the house. "All right," she said without preamble as she stepped onto the terrace. "I've got a plan." Alejandro, whom Julia had finally informed about his sister's visit, watched tensely from the kitchen. "I spoke with Mom yesterday," Luz continued, laying out some papers on the table. "She's serious. Says it's a matter of principle and that she'll prove no one can treat her this way." "As if she's the victim," Alejandro said bitterly, joining them. "In her world, she is," Luz nodded. "She's always the one who's been wronged, and everyone else is just an ungrateful egoist. But I've got an ace up my sleeve." She opened the folder and pulled out several documents stamped with official seals. "Remember the company where she was chief accountant?" she asked Alejandro. "When it went bankrupt, a lot of assets mysteriously disappeared from the books. I was working in HR at the time, and I copied a few things." "What are you talking about?" Alejandro frowned. "Mom always said the company shut down because of poor leadership. That she tried everything to save it." "Of course she said that," Luz snorted. "And as usual, you believed her. But the truth is, there was a very dirty story behind it, asset stripping. Mom was in on it. That's where the apartment in Polanco came from, the house in Cuernavaca, all of it. You really think you can buy all that on an accountant's salary? And you're going to blackmail her with this?" Alejandro asked, uncertain. "Not blackmail, bring her to her senses," Luz corrected. "Show her that she's not untouchable. If she pushes this war, others might get hurt too." Julia stepped in. "I'm not sure this is the right way. Maybe we should just offer her a payment plan. We could gradually pay back the money." "And what about principal?" Luz turned to her. "You used that money on her grandkids." "On my children. That was care, not theft." "But legally," Alejandro started, and Luz cut him off. "To hell with legally. This is family. If Mom wants a war, she'll get one. But I'll give her a chance to back down first." She pulled out her phone and dialed. "Mom? It's me. We need to talk. Come to Alejandro's ranch today." "No, it can't wait. It's about your lawsuit and a few other things." She hung up and smiled at her brother and sister-in-law. "She's coming. She'll be here in an hour." Dona Rosa arrived exactly on time. Unlike her usual loud and dramatic entrances, this time she stepped into the courtyard cautiously, warily, as if sensing a trap. Seeing her daughter's car parked in the driveway, she frowned. "What's going on?" she asked, climbing the terrace steps. "Why this family meeting?" "Sit down, Mama," Luz gestured to a chair. "We need to discuss something." Dona Rosa looked over the group, Alejandro nervously fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth, Julia calmly seated with Miguel in her arms, and Luz confidently spreading out some documents in front of her. "If this is about the money, there's nothing to talk about," she snapped, though she sat down anyway. "I'm not changing my decision." "Not even if it could cost you your freedom?" Luz asked, sliding one of the documents toward her. Dona Rosa's face went pale as she saw the heading. "Where did you get this?" she stammered. "This is blackmail." "It's not blackmail, it's an argument," Luz replied calmly. "You started this war, Mama. But did you consider the consequences? You wouldn't dare," her voice trembled. "I'm your mother." "Exactly," Luz nodded. "And as a mother, you should understand, you can't take a home away from your own son and his family over a petty grudge. Especially when the money was spent on your own grandchildren. That's my money." Dona Rosa slammed her fist on the table. "They should have asked for permission." "And did you ask them for permission before dumping 5 kids on their doorstep?" Luz countered. "No, Mama. You broke the rules first, and now you're furious that someone dared to do the same." Julia, who had been silent until now, rose from her seat. "Dona Rosa," she said quietly, but her voice carried unwavering resolve. "I propose we end this now. You withdraw your claim and lift the lien on our house. In return, we forget this incident ever happened and will not pursue damages for emotional distress." "Damages?" Dona Rosa snapped. "What damages? What do you think?" Julia tilted her head slightly. "Your daughter abandoned her children with you. You brought them to us without warning, creating a chaotic and stressful situation, including for a 3-month-old baby. Then you sued us over money we used to care for your grandchildren. I'd say there are quite a few things we could list. Don't you dare drag Luz into this." Dona Rosa's voice rose to an ultrasonic pitch. "She's a young woman. She has a right to her personal life." "Mama," Alejandro said gently, speaking up for the first time. "We're grateful for your help. But that doesn't mean you can control our lives or demand absolute obedience." "I'm not demanding obedience," Dona Rosa snapped. "I'm demanding respect." "Respect has to be earned," Julia said calmly. "Through actions, not status." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dona Rosa stared into the distance, her lips pressed into a thin, tense line. It was clear there was a battle going on inside her. "Fine," she said at last, her voice unusually quiet. "I'll withdraw the lawsuit." "And you'll apologize to Julia and Alejandro," Luz added. "Don't push it," Dona Rosa muttered. "Okay, no apologies," Julia agreed. "Let's just close this chapter and start over." Dona Rosa nodded, then stood, straightening her shoulders. "I'll call my lawyer," she said. "The papers will be withdrawn by tomorrow." Once the door closed behind her, the three of them exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath the whole time. "I can't believe that actually worked," Alejandro murmured, pulling Julia into a hug. "It hasn't quite worked yet," Luz warned. "Tomorrow we check that she actually withdrew the claim." 2 weeks passed. The lien on the house and land was lifted, and the lawsuit was officially withdrawn. Luz picked up the kids from camp, and they all spent the weekend together at Alejandro and Julia's ranch. Surprisingly, the children came back changed, more disciplined, calmer, and noticeably more respectful of others' space. Even little Carlos, once the loudest and most unruly, now asked for permission before taking anything, and carefully played with the garden toys without breaking or scattering them. "I never would have believed 3 weeks in camp could change them so much," Luz admitted as she watched the twins helping Alejandro collect fallen avocados in the orchard. "Sometimes," Julia smiled, gently rocking Miguel in her arms, "all they need is the right direction and consistent rules." "You know," Luz said suddenly, looking at her sister-in-law with newfound respect, "I used to think you were soft, spineless. But turns out, you're tough as nails." "You don't always have to yell and fight to stand your ground," Julia shrugged. "Sometimes it's enough just to know what you want and calmly go after it." Luz nodded, lost in thought. "I've been rethinking a lot these past weeks," she admitted. "The camp, Mom, it all made me realize I've been running from responsibility for too long. For myself, for my kids. Maybe it's time to stop running and start building something. Not just tearing things down." Julia looked at her, surprised. Such seriousness was rare for Luz. "I think you can do it," she said sincerely. "You're strong. And you love your kids, even if you're not always sure how to show it." Luz smiled gratefully. Between them, a new understanding began to take shape, not quite friendship, but mutual respect and acceptance. That evening, after the children were asleep and Luz had left for the city, Julia and Alejandro sat on the terrace, looking up at the starry sky. Miguel snored softly in his carrier beside them. "Who would have thought things would turn out like this?" Alejandro said thoughtfully. "When Mom brought the kids, I thought it was a disaster." "It was," Julia smiled. "But sometimes disasters lead to unexpected outcomes." "Like what?" He turned to her. "Like Luz finally starting to grow up," Julia gently rocked Miguel's carrier as the baby stirred. "And like you and me, growing stronger. Together." Alejandro wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You know what's most surprising?" he said. "Mom called me today. Said she thought everything over and she doesn't want to lose contact with her grandson. Julia looked at him in surprise. She said that? Yeah, Alejandro gave a faint smile. Didn't apologize, of course. But it's progress. Said she wants to visit us. See Miguel. And she didn't mention the money. That is progress, Julia laughed, though there was a note of caution in her voice. Dona Rosa wasn't one to forget her grievances easily. Still, under the starry sky, with the quiet breath of their son beside them, she let herself believe, maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. The following days passed in a calm rhythm. Julia returned to her flower beds, Alejandro to his work, and Miguel delighted his parents with his first smiles. Luz, as promised, took the children and even sent Julia some photos, Carlos holding his award for a craft project, Katerina with her friends by the lake, the twins with a soccer ball. Thank you for giving them this chance, she wrote in a message, and Julia felt a quiet warmth from those words. But the shadow of Dona Rosa still lingered over their home. A week after the property lien was lifted, Julia received a letter, not official, but handwritten. Her mother-in-law wrote that, for the sake of peace in the family, she had decided not to pursue the money issue further, but expected proper respect from Julia and Alejandro in the future. And don't forget that I helped you with this ranch, she added at the end, unable to resist one last reminder. Julia showed the letter to Alejandro. What do you think? She asked. I think it's her way of saving face, he replied with a shrug. She won't apologize, but she doesn't want to keep fighting, at least not for now. For now, Julia echoed, looking out the window at her flowers swaying in the breeze. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. Dona Rosa, like a seasoned strategist, might be lying low, waiting for the right moment. But Julia was ready. She had learned how to protect her space, and that lesson was worth more than any money. On the last day of August, as summer gave way to the first chill of autumn, Julia stepped into the garden with Miguel in her arms. The flower beds were still full of color, though some blossoms had started to wilt. She looked at the house, at the avocado tree she and Alejandro had planted, at the swing gently creaking in the wind. This was their place. Their home. Their life. We'll be okay, won't we, my little one, she whispered to Miguel, and he answered her with a happy gurgle. Alejandro stepped onto the terrace, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Coming, he called, smiling. Julia nodded and walked toward him, feeling warmth rise inside her. Whatever waited for them ahead, new challenges, new battles, they were together. And that was what mattered most.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.